The air in the underground Amsterdam arena was thick with cigar smoke and spilled gin. In one corner stood a 240-pound Dutch kickboxing titan, a mountain of muscle and unyielding fury. In the other, a 135-pound martial arts pioneer. The world whispered it was suicide. They were dead wrong. The year was 1971. The cold, unrelenting rain of late November whipped across the cobblestone streets of Amsterdam, reflecting the neon signs of the city's red light district. It was an era where martial arts was still shrouded in rigid traditions and geographical boundaries, a time before the globalization of combat sports. Mr. Lee, the legendary pioneer of a revolutionary fluid martial arts system, was touring Europe. Ostensibly, the trip was for scouting filming locations and expanding his network of martial artists. But in reality, Lee was always testing his philosophy against the world's most brutal fighting styles. At the time, the Netherlands was quietly forging a reputation as the most unforgiving striking crucible in the Western world. Dutch kickboxing, a terrifying amalgamation of Kyokushin karate, Western boxing and Muay Thai, was being born in the gritty, unheated gymnasiums of Amsterdam. It relied on raw power, low kicks that could chop down oak trees, and a relentless, forward-marching aggression. On a damp Tuesday evening, Lee, accompanied by his American associate, Tiago, visited the Iron Lion, a notorious underground gym managed by Willem Roest. Willem was a towering, heavily scarred veteran of the early European bare-knuckle circuit, and his gym was less of a dojo and more of an abattoir for combatants. Heavy leather bags swung from the ceiling, stained with years of sweat and blood. The air tasted of rust and ammonia. Lee had been invited by Willem to demonstrate his unique philosophy, the way of the intercepting fist. Stepping onto the worn canvas, the 135-pound master moved like liquid mercury. He demonstrated explosive speed, trapping techniques, and strikes that broke the sound barrier before snapping back to his guard. The few fighters in attendance watched in a mix of awe and skeptical silence. To the heavy-hitting Dutch brawlers, Lee's movements looked almost too beautiful to be destructive. Then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the gym slammed open. In walked Ingrid van der Steen. Standing 6'2" and weighing an astonishing 240 pounds, Ingrid was the reigning, undisputed female heavyweight champion of the European underground circuit. Built like a Soviet powerlifter, with the agility of a heavyweight boxer, she was a terrifying force of nature. She had a reputation for sparring with, and frequently knocking out, men in the heavyweight division. Her nickname in the circuit was the Dutch Avalanche. Ingrid dropped her canvas duffel bag to the floor with a heavy thud. She watched Lee's demonstration for a few moments, her arms crossed over her massive chest. A cynical smirk played on her lips. "Beautiful," Ingrid's voice boomed across the silent gym, dripping with thick Dutch sarcasm. She stepped onto the edge of the mats, her heavy boots squeaking against the vinyl. "It looks like a very nice dance. But what happens when the dance partner doesn't want to play along? What happens when a real heavyweight simply walks through your little hand slaps?" Tiago bristled, stepping forward, but Lee raised a single calm hand to stop him. Lee turned to face the giantess. The size disparity was almost comical. Ingrid outweighed him by over 100 pounds and towered over him. "The size of the opponent matters only if you plan on standing still and letting them hit you," Lee replied smoothly, a polite but dangerous smile touching his eyes. "Water can flow, or it can crash. It does not need mass to destroy the rock." Ingrid laughed, a booming, harsh sound. "Water? I am not a rock, little man. I am a bulldozer. In a real fight, in a ring where you cannot run away, mass crushes speed, every single time. Your philosophy is for the movies. My power is for the street." The gym went dead silent. The disrespect was palpable. Willem Roast shifted nervously. Even in this brutal gym, Lee was a respected guest. But Ingrid was their undisputed queen, the pride of the Amsterdam striking scene. "Perhaps," Lee said softly, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor. "You would like to test that theory?" Ingrid's eyes narrowed. "I don't spar with lightweights. I don't want to break you before your next film." "We won't spar," Lee answered, stepping to the center of the mat, slipping off his jacket to reveal his incredibly lean, heavily muscled frame. "We will fight, unless the bulldozer is afraid of a little water." The challenge hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Ingrid stepped fully onto the mat, cracking her knuckles, a cruel smile spreading across her face. "Friday night," she declared, "at the Docks Arena. No headgear, no shin pads. Let's see if your philosophy bleeds." News of the challenge spread through the European combat underworld like a wildfire. It was an anomaly, a freak show to some, and a philosophical war to others. The ultimate clash of David and Goliath. A 135-pound speed-based martial artist against a 240-pound pure power striker. The match quickly drew the attention of the city's unsavory elements. Enter Cornelis, a wealthy, ruthless syndicate boss who controlled the illegal gambling rings along the Amsterdam canals. Cornelis saw a gold mine. He aggressively took over the promotion of the fight, moving it from a standard gym ring to an illegal, high-stakes arena, hidden within an abandoned warehouse down by the harbor. Cornelis also introduced a brutal twist to the contract. Sensing that Lee's only advantage was his footwork and evasion, Cornelis altered the ring dimensions. Instead of a standard 20-foot boxing ring, the fight would take place in a modified 16-foot square, enclosed by thick, unyielding ropes. Furthermore, the fight would be unsanctioned, governed only by a gentleman's agreement. No eye gouging, no groin strikes. Everything else, elbows, knees, throws, and bare-knuckle strikes, was entirely legal. Tiago pleaded with Lee to back out. "It's a trap," Tiago argued vehemently in their hotel room, pacing across the worn carpet. "She has a 105-pound weight advantage. They're shrinking the ring to take away your angles. One clean hook from her, just one, and your jaw is shattered. It's simple physics." Lee, sitting on the floor in a perfect lotus position, calmly poured a cup of jasmine tea. "Tiago, physics dictates that a moving object generates force based on speed as much as mass. She is strong, yes, but she is bound by rhythm. She operates on a heavy, predictable tempo. I will not be where her strikes land. I will be the empty space she punches into." While Lee prepared his mind through meditation and isometric nerve training, Ingrid's camp was a theater of intimidation. Cornelis had invited select high rollers to watch her train. She decimated heavy bags, the loud crack of her roundhouse kicks echoing off the warehouse walls like shotgun blasts. She sparred with 2 male middleweights simultaneously, walking through their punches and throwing them to the canvas with terrifying ease. She was training not just to win, but to maim. The weigh-in took place on Thursday night, a day before the fight, inside the smoky back room of Cornelis's primary casino. The atmosphere was incredibly tense, packed with local mobsters, skeptical martial artists, and heavily armed security. Ingrid stepped onto the industrial scale first. She wore heavy canvas shorts and a tight tank top. The needle violently swung and settled at exactly 242 pounds. The room erupted in cheers and the clinking of glasses. She flexed her massive, corded shoulders, her eyes locked onto Lee. Lee stepped up next. Stripped to his waist, every muscle fiber in his body was visible, pulled taut like steel cables under his skin. He was the epitome of human conditioning, carrying 0% excess body fat. The scale settled at 136 pounds. The visual contrast was shocking. The crowd laughed openly. Cornelis stood behind Ingrid, a smug, cigar-chomping grin on his face. "Are you sure you want to do this, Mr. Lee?" Cornelis sneered. "I can arrange a flight back to America for you. No shame in running from a tank." Lee didn't look at Cornelis. He stepped off the scale and walked directly up to Ingrid. She had to look down at him, her chest puffed out in dominance. "Tomorrow night," Lee said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying a frequency that commanded absolute silence in the room. "You will learn that gravity and mass are only weapons if you can touch your target. Bring all your weight, Ingrid. You will need it to cushion your fall." Friday night arrived, bringing with it a torrential downpour. The abandoned warehouse by the harbour was packed with over 500 rabid spectators. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, cheap beer, and raw adrenaline. The makeshift 16-foot ring sat in the centre, under harsh, swinging halogen lights. The betting odds were astronomical. The local syndicate was offering 10-to-1 odds against Lee. Nobody believed a man of his size could survive a small, enclosed space with the Dutch avalanche. Ingrid made her walk to the ring first. The crowd roared as she stalked down the aisle, her massive frame parting the sea of spectators like an icebreaker ship. She climbed through the ropes, bouncing heavily on the canvas, shadowboxing with terrifying, heavy hooks. Then the lights dimmed slightly. There was no loud music, no dramatic entrance. Lee simply walked out of the shadows, flanked only by Tiago. He wore his traditional dark martial arts trousers and soft-soled canvas shoes. His face was an emotionless mask, his eyes completely void of fear, anger, or excitement. He looked like a man walking into his own living room. As Lee slipped fluidly between the ropes, the crowd hurled insults, but he didn't seem to hear them. He stood in his corner, lightly bouncing on his toes, shaking out his arms. The referee, a massive, scarred enforcer on Cornelis's payroll, called them to the center of the ring. "You know the rules," the referee barked, looking back and forth between the two fighters. "Protect yourselves at all times. Touch gloves." Ingrid sneered, refusing to raise her hands. "I'm going to break you in half," she growled. Lee did not respond. He simply slid his right foot back, turning his body completely bladed, presenting the smallest possible target. He raised his lead hand, his fingers loose and relaxed. The bell rang. The bell's sharp clang shattered the heavy tension in the warehouse. Instantly, Ingrid erupted from her corner. There was no feeling-out process, no probing jabs. The Dutch avalanche surged forward with terrifying, earth-shaking steps, launching a massive right low kick aimed directly at Lee's lead thigh. The sheer velocity and weight behind her leg were enough to snap a femur in half. Lee vanished. He didn't jump back. He simply wasn't there. Using a frictionless pendulum step, he slid backward just enough to let the devastating kick cleave entirely through empty air. The momentum of her own miss pulled Ingrid slightly off balance, her heavy boot slamming into the canvas with a resounding thud. Before she could recover her stance, Lee was inside her guard. He didn't throw a looping punch or a high kick. He executed a lightning-fast, snapping back fist that cracked against the bridge of her nose. It sounded like a wet whip. Blood immediately sprayed across the harsh white lights, dotting the canvas. The crowd gasped. It was the very first exchange, and their unstoppable queen was bleeding. Ingrid roared, shaking her head like a wounded bear, and lunged forward, throwing a barrage of heavy hooks. Each punch displaced the air around it, creating a whooshing sound that echoed over the crowd shouting. Lee slipped under the right, pivoted around the left, and countered with 2 rapid-fire straight punches to her floating ribs. But here, the brutal reality of the weight disparity manifested. while Lee's strikes were impossibly fast. Striking a 240-pound wall of muscle required immense kinetic transfer. Ingrid barely flinched. She absorbed the rib strikes and used Lee's proximity to her advantage, stepping forward to trap him in the undersized 16-foot ring. Lee circled away, but as he pivoted off his back foot to create an angle, disaster struck. His foot sank. Cornelis, the syndicate boss, had not merely shrunk the ring, he had sabotaged it. The outer edges of the canvas were stretched tight, but the center and the corners rested over deeply padded, unsanded floorboards. It was like trying to perform intricate footwork in a swamp. Lee's canvas shoe dug into the soft spot, arresting his lateral movement for a fraction of a second. Against an amateur, it wouldn't have mattered. Against an elite heavyweight champion, it was lethal. Seeing the hesitation, Ingrid closed the distance in a single explosive bound. She threw a clubbing left hook. Lee managed to raise his guard, but the sheer mass of the blow crashed through his forearm, violently colliding with the side of his head. The impact lifted the 135-pound master completely off his feet. He was thrown sideways, crashing heavily into the stiff, unyielding hemp ropes. The warehouse erupted into absolute pandemonium. Men screamed in bloodlust. Cornelis pumped a fist in the air, his cigar clamped tightly between his teeth. Tiago slammed his hands against the apron. "Get off the ropes! Move!" Lee rebounded off the ropes, his vision temporarily fracturing into doubling stars. A nasty gash opened above his right eye, warm blood trickling down his cheek. Ingrid didn't hesitate. Smelling blood, she rushed in like a freight train, launching a devastating knee strike aimed directly at his ribcage to finish the fight. Time seemed to slow down. Lee was cornered, his mobility neutralized by the sabotaged mat, facing an opponent who could crush his ribs with a single impact. He could not run. He could not dance. So, he rooted. The underground Amsterdam bout of 1971 remains a whispered legend in martial arts history. It proved that true power does not merely come from raw physical mass, but from flawless biomechanics, supreme speed, and an unbreakable spirit. Lee dismantled a giant not by matching her strength, but by neutralizing it. The Dutch avalanche fell, leaving behind a legacy that forever changed how the world understood the profound science of combat. Air completely vanished from Lee's chest. The sheer, crushing pressure of Saskia's 240-pound frame clamping around his ribs was like being caught in an industrial vice. The crowd roared, a deafening sound of bloodlust, anticipating the spectacular slam that would undoubtedly shatter the much smaller man's spine against the unyielding wooden planks of the ring. Willem de Groot was already screaming in premature victory from the corner, his face red with manic joy. But Lee was a master of anatomy, not just movement. In that agonizing fraction of a second, with his feet dangling inches above the canvas and his vision beginning to blur at the edges, he didn't panic. He didn't attempt to use his own strength to break a grip forged by moving literal tons of iron in Dutch powerlifting gyms. Instead, he weaponized his own entrapment, dropping his body weight entirely to make himself as heavy and dead-weighted as possible. Lee simultaneously brought his right thumb up in a vicious, highly localized strike. He dug the hardened digit directly into the brachial plexus nerve cluster, hidden deep beneath the thick musculature of Saskia's armpit and shoulder tie-in. The reaction was instantaneous and violently involuntary. A shockwave of nerve pain shot down Saskia's massive arm, causing her bicep to instantly spasm and release its structural lock. Her grip failed for a microsecond. It was all the master needed. Lee slithered down her front like water, his feet hitting the canvas with a soft thud. Before the giantess could recover from the paralyzing nerve strike, Lee pivoted sharply on his heel, driving a short, piston-like elbow directly into her solar plexus. It wasn't enough to drop a 240-pound behemoth, but it forced the air from her lungs in a sharp hiss. Saskia stumbled backward, her cold blue eyes widening in a mixture of shock and sudden, burning fury. Before she could launch a retaliatory strike, the bell rang, signaling the end of the first round. The warehouse erupted into a chaotic symphony of boos and astonished murmurs. Nobody had expected the smaller man to survive that clinch. In the damp, dimly lit corner, Arthur rapidly wiped sweat from Lee's brow, his hands trembling. Raymond leaned over the ropes, his face pale with genuine terror. "Call it off," Raymond pleaded, his voice cracking over the noise of the crowd. "You proved your point. You survived a round. If she gets her hands on you again, I won't be able to bring you home in one piece. Her mass is just too much." Lee took a deep, measured breath, his chest expanding as he centered his heart rate. "Her mass is her weapon, Raymond," Lee said quietly, his gaze fixed across the ring where de Groot was furiously massaging Saskia's spasming arm. "But it is also her anchor. She requires distance to build the kinetic energy needed to destroy me. If I retreat, I give her the runway she needs. I have been fighting her fight. Now she must fight mine." Arthur looked confused. "You can't trade blows with her in the pocket. One hook and your jaw is wired shut for a year." "I won't trade," Lee whispered, his eyes narrowing into dark slits of absolute focus. "I will intercept." The bell for the second round pierced the smoky air. Saskia stormed out of her corner, no longer wearing the confident smirk of a hunter, but the enraged scowl of a titan who had been embarrassed by a mortal. She abandoned the measured kickboxing approach and charged forward like a derailed freight train, throwing a terrifying combination of wide, looping hooks meant to simply bulldoze through whatever guard Lee presented. But Lee didn't retreat. As the massive Dutch champion barreled toward him, Lee stepped forward. It was a counterintuitive, suicidal-looking maneuver. But this was the core doctrine of his martial philosophy, the intercepting fist. Saskia launched a devastating right cross, a punch carrying the weight of a small boulder. Instead of dodging backward, Lee slipped sharply to the inside of the punch, entirely closing the distance before her arm could reach its maximum velocity and devastating apex. As her arm flew harmlessly past his left ear, Lee's own right fist shot forward, traveling a mere 4 inches, but carrying the torqued, rotational force of his entire lower body. He struck her squarely on the chin. Crack! Saskia's head snapped back violently. The crowd gasped, but the sheer thickness of her neck absorbed the trauma. She absorbed the strike, but the momentum of her own charge had been broken. For the next 2 minutes, the arena witnessed a masterful dissection of geometry. Every time Saskia tried to initiate a heavy attack, Lee was already there, smothering her strikes before they could generate power, landing stinging, rapid-fire jabs to her eyes and throat line, frustrating her, forcing her to reset. He was a phantom, existing perfectly in the eye of the hurricane, untouched by the devastating winds whirling around him. De Groot slammed his hands on the mat. "Sweep the legs! Chop the tree down!" he roared in Dutch. Saskia, her face reddened and bruised from a dozen intercepted jabs, heard her manager. She possessed a brilliant fight, EQ, beneath her monstrous exterior. She realized she couldn't outspeed his hands. So, she set a trap. With 30 seconds left in the round, Saskia feinted a heavy left hook, the exact punch Lee had been slipping inside of all round. Lee took the bait, sliding inside the arc to deliver a counter. But the hook never came. It was a phantom strike. Instead, Saskia planted all 240 pounds onto her back foot and unleashed a horrific, scythe-like low kick aimed directly at Lee's lead thigh. Lee saw the trap close a fraction of a second too late. He attempted to pull his leg back, but the hardened shin of the kickboxing champion connected with the side of his knee with the sickening sound of a baseball bat hitting wet bamboo. A sharp, audible crack echoed through the warehouse. Lee was swept off his feet entirely, spinning in the air before crashing hard onto his side. The crowd exploded. This was the European dominance they had paid to see. The small philosopher was finally broken. Lee rolled, his face a sudden mask of blinding agony, clutching his knee. Peter, the referee, rushed in to start the count. 1, 2, 3, Arthur screamed from the corner, throwing a towel over his shoulder, ready to toss it into the ring. Raymond covered his eyes. 4, 5. At the count of 6, Lee grabbed the top rope. His knuckles turned white. With a terrifying display of sheer willpower, he pulled himself up. He couldn't put full weight on his left leg. He was visibly compromised, favoring his right side, his legendary mobility severely handicapped. Saskia stalked forward, a predator smelling blood. She readied a flying knee to finish the crippled master, but before she could launch, the bell rang, saving Lee from an immediate knockout. He limped heavily back to his stool, collapsing onto it. The atmosphere in the warehouse during the minute rest period was electric with absolute certainty. The betting lines had shifted completely. Willem de Groot was already pouring champagne in his corner, laughing with the local gangsters. Saskia paced her corner like a caged tiger, her eyes locked on Lee's swollen, rapidly bruising knee. "It's over," Raymond said, tears welling in his eyes as he looked at the damage. "Arthur, throw the towel. He can't move. She's going to kill him in there." Arthur gripped the white towel, looking at his mentor. "He's right. Your base is compromised. You can't intercept without your footwork. There is no shame in this." Lee looked up, his eyes strangely calm, devoid of the pain that was clearly racking his lower body. He reached out and grabbed Arthur's wrist, stopping him from throwing the towel. "Water!" Lee rasped, his voice barely audible over the roaring crowd. "Water does not need a leg to flow. If she comes like a mountain, I will not stand before her. I will crash against her base. Do not stop this fight." The bell for the third and final round rang. It sounded like an executioner's toll. Saskia marched to the center of the ring. Lee hobbled forward, his stance entirely altered. He was heavily bladed, keeping his injured leg trailing, relying almost entirely on his right leg for balance. He looked vulnerable, a wounded animal waiting to be put out of its misery. "Finish him, Saskia," de Groot bellowed. Saskia didn't hesitate. She wanted a spectacular knockout for the newspapers. She dropped her guard slightly, loaded all her immense weight, and launched herself forward with a devastating, leaping front kick aimed directly at Lee's face. It was a high-risk, high-reward strike, carrying the full kinetic force of her 240-pound frame hurtling through the air. This was the moment Lee had calculated. He knew she would overcommit. He knew the scent of a wounded prey would override her tactical patience. As the massive foot hurtled toward his jaw, Lee didn't try to block or intercept. He collapsed his own structure. Bending his good knee entirely, he dropped underneath the flying strike, dropping almost entirely to the canvas. Saskia's foot sailed over his head by an inch. Because she was airborne and fully committed to the forward momentum, Saskia could not change direction. She was entirely at the mercy of gravity and physics. As she sailed over him, Lee planted his right fist firmly against her exposed descending solar plexus, right below the sternum, locking his arm into a rigid, structural post anchored to the canvas beneath him. He didn't punch her. He let her punch herself. Saskia's 240 pounds of forward-downward velocity collided instantly with the immovable, structurally perfect post of Lee's locked arm. The physics of the impact were devastating. The force of her own mass rebounded entirely back into her body, concentrated on the 2 square inches of Lee's knuckles resting against her diaphragm. The sound was a wet, hollow thud that silenced the entire warehouse. Saskia's eyes rolled back in her head before she even hit the ground. Her body crumpled, completely devoid of oxygen, the central nervous system instantly shutting down from the catastrophic trauma to the solar plexus. She crashed onto the wooden planks like a felled oak tree, completely unconscious, raising a cloud of dust and rosin from the mat. The silence in Daoud Shore was absolute. For 5 agonizing seconds, nobody breathed. 3,000 people stared in horrified disbelief as the massive Dutch champion lay motionless on the canvas, while the 135-pound master slowly, painfully pushed himself up from the floor, leaning against the ropes for support. Peter didn't even bother to count. He frantically waved his hands, calling for the ringside doctors. Willem de Groot dropped his champagne glass. It shattered, the only sound in the cavernous room. Johan Dirk, the journalist, stared at his notepad, entirely forgetting to write down what he had just witnessed. It defied logic. It defied reality. Arthur and Raymond rushed into the ring, catching Lee as his injured leg finally gave out. They supported his weight, looking down at the fallen giantess. Slowly, a low murmur began to build in the crowd, growing into a scattered applause, and finally erupting into a deafening, standing ovation from the hardened European fight fans. They had come to see a massacre, but they had witnessed a miracle of physics and unparalleled martial genius. Lee looked down at Saskia, his face respectful, empty of malice. He had proven his truth. When absolute power meets perfect structure, water ultimately breaks the stone. This forgotten Amsterdam bout proves that true mastery overcomes any physical disadvantage. When speed meets unyielding mass, water ultimately cracks the stone. Did Lee's tactical genius inspire you? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, smash that like button, share this incredible piece of martial arts history with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more legendary, untold stories from the ring.